The Shadow Attorney-General, George Brandis, has tonight delivered a swingeing attack on the Gillard Government for what he calls a war on free speech. In an address to the Sydney Institute, Senator Brandis said the government's proposed media reforms were the worst attack on press freedom in Australia in nearly 200 years. He went on to say that under the Labor government, victimhood had become the basis of a new kind of privilege, and that showing respect to its special status had become a more important value than the freedom to call that status into question. George Brandis claims that the coalition has been the only party which has stood steadfastly on the side of freedom. He joined me here in the studio a short time ago. Senator Brandis, welcome to Late Line.
Hello, Emma.
You assert in your speech that the government's media reforms, which they recently abandoned, represented the most overt interference by an Australian government with the freedom of the press since 1825. How have you reached that conclusion?
Well, this was the public interest media advocate that Senator Conroy wanted to foist on us, was in fact the first measure, at least in peacetime, that had been undertaken in this country which could have had the consequence of a government official telling newspapers and media outlets what they were at liberty to say and what they were not at liberty to say in their media. Now, that hasn't happened before.
And but the legislation didn't say that.
The public interest media advocates' determinations could have had that consequence.
Do you believe the electronic media in Australia is facing government censorship?
I think that the withdrawal of the media regulation package that Senator Conroy was so wedded to was a great victory for freedom of speech. I'm aware, of course, that there are different issues between newspapers and the electronic media, because the electronic media obviously use a public resource in a way that newspapers and magazines don't. But nevertheless, I think a common philosophical principle strongly in defence of freedom of speech and freedom of the press unites them both.
Is there any reason, though, why broadcast media should be regulated in a way that the press is not?
Well, because, as I said a moment ago, spectrum is a public resource.
But that aside, in principle, do you think that they should be regulated differently?
I don't think it's possible to just say, put that aside, because that, I think, is the principal functional difference between the two.
Well, social media, for instance, is not regulated at all.
That's right, but it doesn't use the same public resources as the electronic media do.
Is the internet not a public resource?
Well, it's a good question that I'm sure my colleague Malcolm Turnbull, the Shadow Minister for Communications, would be very eloquent on. But what I address in the speech that I gave to the Sydney Institute tonight is a philosophical issue, and that is to call public attention to the concern that I have, and that I think a growing number of Australians have, that there is an instinct on the part of this government to diminish the centrality of belief in freedom of speech, which includes freedom of the press, in Australian politics in a way that I haven't seen before in my life.
But in a democratic society, freedom can't be absolute.
No, and I don't think anybody disputes that freedom can't be absolute, but I tell you, if there is one species of freedom which ought to be as little qualified as possible, it's intellectual freedom. Freedom of thought, freedom of speech, freedom of expression. You see, as a Liberal, I put that right up at the top of the philosophical priorities that make a decent and well-ordered society. And I'm afraid this government has quite a different disposition, and the fact that we had not just the attempt to regulate the media, we also had this harebrained Human Rights and Anti-Discrimination Act, which would have made it against the law to express political opinions merely because they were offensive or insulting in the eyes of some people. The fact that we even had brought to the Parliament by Mr Crean on his last day, literally, as the Arts Minister, amendments to the Australia Council legislation which would have taken freedom of artistic expression out of the core objectives or purposes of the Australia Council. That is an expression in cultural policy of the same phenomenon, which was the purpose of my speech to call attention to.
Now, you say you're surprised that media shield laws are the #1 concern of journalists right now. What surprises you about that?
Well, I tell you the point I made. I talked about the press freedom dinner that I attended along with Mr Turnbull in Sydney last Friday night. There were no Labor politicians there, by the way, but Mr Turnbull and I were there on behalf of the opposition. It is barely a month since the government abandoned what I claim, I think fairly, to be potentially the most invasive interference with press freedom in Australian history since before the Commonwealth of Australia began, since 1825. If you were going to have a dinner devoted to press freedom, I would have thought that would be the big issue on the table. It was mentioned, it was adverted to by some, but the entire evening was about largely about journalist shield laws. Now, I've got no problem with journalist shield laws. In fact, the Commonwealth journalist shield laws, as they exist in their current form, were introduced into the Parliament not by the government, but by me, as a private senator's bill, which the government then adopted. So there is no greater friend of journalist shield laws than me, but it seemed when I attended this occasion, when there's just been this wonderful political victory won against regulation of the media, that would have been at the top of everyone's mind.
I think part of the reason perhaps why it wasn't the top of everyone's mind is that the jury is out about just how damaging and draconian those media reforms actually were. And in fact, the criticism was coming mainly from commercial press bosses and from the opposition. Well, the people who drafted, for instance, the original Finkelstein report, including Ray Finkelstein himself, certainly didn't suggest some kind of government censorship of the press.
Well, I've read Mr Finkelstein's report, and there are parts of Mr Finkelstein's report, particularly the philosophical chapter, the second chapter of the report, which I as a Liberal find very alarming. Mr Finkelstein speaks of the new intellectual climate of the 20th century, which plays less emphasis to traditional classical liberal rights of freedom of speech and expression. I think that was a terrible point of departure for the Finkelstein report. But let me challenge your thesis, Emma, that the jury is still out. I think the jury came back when the government dropped the legislation. We were having a debate about how draconian it was. You've heard me say what my view is, and that was the opposition's view. It was ultimately the view of the independents, and the government has dropped this, and I don't see it coming back, and I'm glad it won't.
Now, the court battle between billionaire miner Gina Rinehart and two of the country's leading journalists. The media union labels that dispute, as you made reference to over the media dinner. They say it's the greatest threat to free speech facing Australia. Now, how do you prevent this situation where journalists face the prospect of going to jail for not revealing their sources?
Well, as I said to you before, Emma, I'm a supporter of shield laws. In fact, I'm the author of the Commonwealth's shield laws.
They've clearly not worked in this situation.
Even though we did it from opposition and we shamed the Labor Party into adopting them. So I'm entirely...
Well, you didn't introduce them in your term of government, let's be fair.
Well, I introduced them in the Senate. The government adopted them. So let's give credit where it's due. I'm entirely on the journalist side in relation to Gina Rinehart. I said at the time I introduced the legislation, and I strongly believe that the relationship between journalists and sources ought to be regarded by the law as among those categories of confidential relationships which the law protects.
Can you commit a coalition government to introducing legislation that would somehow provide some sort of consistency throughout the country with regard to shield laws?
Well, I think we've done our bit. I mean, we have written shield laws which apply to the Commonwealth, within the Commonwealth's jurisdiction. But of course, most of these cases are heard in state and territory Supreme Courts or other state and territory courts, which are governed by state laws. Now, I can see a perfectly good argument for there being consistency among the various jurisdictions, but that's up to those jurisdictions.
There's no way for a federal government to bring in some sort of uniformity?
No, I don't think that the Commonwealth could in the exercise of its legislative power, overturn state shield laws. That's not to say, as an exercise in cooperative federalism, there couldn't be some move towards uniformity. As I said to you in answer to your earlier question, that seems to me in principle to be a desirable thing.
Now, the theme of your speech is summed up in one of the opening lines where you say that, in your view, this government is engaged in a multi-front war against the traditional liberal conception of freedom of speech. Now, that same criticism was often levelled at John Howard's government, specifically, for instance, over the coalition's attempts to prevent charities, for instance, from criticising the government with gagging orders.
I think that's an entirely different issue. When people give money to charities, they expect... that was an issue of corporate governance, in effect, the corporate governance of charities. When people give money to charities, they are entitled to expect the charities to spend that money on the purposes for which the money is donated, not on political causes. So I think it is bogus to regard that as a freedom of speech issue. Look at the real assaults on freedom of speech we've had. We've talked at length.
Can I just go back to this point? Because John Howard actually threatened to remove the tax-free status of charities and church groups who lobbied for a change of laws, who criticised the government. This is not about how they spend their money. This was specifically aimed, many called it, muzzling the charities and church groups.
Emma, it's an entirely different issue. If you want to quote to me the very words that Mr Howard used, that you've paraphrased, then I'll comment on them. But I know what the Howard government's position was, and I think it was the right position. It was a corporate governance issue. You cannot go into the public arena as a charity, ask people to donate money to your charity, and then spend it on a purpose other than the purpose for which it was given.
As I understood, this was around the time of the CES going to the Job Network situation where church groups and charities were taking over some of that work. And as I understand it, this was the government saying to those charities, we'll give you these contracts, this money, on the proviso that you don't criticise us in return.
Well, that might be your understanding, but I don't want to talk about a particular instance on which neither you nor I are specifically informed. But
you were in that government.
But let me just make this point. Freedom of speech is about the right of people to express their opinions, about the right of newspapers and the media to carry the expression of opinions, to participate in an unfettered way in the democratic debate. It's not an issue about corporate governance, which the charities issue was an issue concerning.
Because I'm specifically interested, obviously your speech talks about this government attacking freedoms in a way that hasn't been seen since 1825. And so I'm just giving you some other instances where it seems that the same point could be argued. For instance, let me give you another one. The Howard government's terror laws were also considered an attack on basic freedoms. Suspects held for 48 hours without charge or without being given any reason at all. Control orders for up to 12 months. And the proposition that people be jailed for simply promoting feelings of ill will.
All right, well, let me say two things about that. First of all, those laws were criticised not as an attack on freedom of speech, but an attack on other civil liberties. So, you know, my argument is specifically about freedom of speech. It's not a general argument about civil liberty. It's an argument about what I regard as the most important among the civil liberties, and that is freedom of speech. Secondly, as a result of the intervention and the negotiation at that time between people who were then on the government backbench, Mr Malcolm Turnbull, Senator Maurice Payne, Petro Georgiou, me, the original proposals were hedged with very significant safeguards. Thirdly, the alarmist rhetoric that we heard from people on the left of politics, that this was legislation that would destroy our civil liberties, has not been realised in the event. There have been hardly any control orders. There have been no preventive detention orders in all the years since.
And let's finally discuss one more thing I'll point out from your speech. You say defending freedom of speech today has been left down to conservative commentators, Andrew Bolt and Janet Alberici. I'd put it to you that all of us in the media across the spectrum are defenders of freedom of speech.
Well, I wish you were, Emma. I wish you were. I wish there'd been more outrage from all quarters in the media when Stephen Conroy tried to do what eventually he failed to do, and that is introduce a public interest media advocate that could, in certain circumstances, have resulted in the government or officials sitting around Lake Burley Griffin making decisions about what ordinary citizens were allowed to listen to on their radio or to read in their newspapers. I wish there'd been more outrage from the media, but my point is there wasn't, and I find that very disappointing.
Thank you very much for coming in this evening.
Thanks, Emma.